Chapter 25. Shiro isn't quite sure how he ended up in this position. Before him stood two individuals, one clearly a servant wielding a shield taller than even he, and the other a girl wearing a strange mystic code, and with auburn hair and orange eyes, much like his own. With a somewhat embarrassed smile, he faces them, doing his best to ignore Merlin's annoying yappings from inside his head. My name's Shiro. What's your name? Why so high up? Shiro asked with a soft sigh, watching idly as he continued his descent down onto the earth. I wanted to see how skydiving would feel. He heard Merlin giggle. It's quite refreshing. Shiro sighed again. The Magus clearly had some other reason for dropping them kilometers above the ground, but he'd rather focus on landing correctly than figuring out what goes on through Merlin's head. It'd most likely take a couple minutes before he reached the ground, faster if he broke past terminal velocity. But he didn't do that. Besides, the feeling of the air washing past him was quite refreshing as well. See, you're enjoying it. I've been influenced. Shiro replied dryly, gaining another amused giggle from the woman. In truth, he didn't really mind. As much as he liked spending his time getting Saber reacquainted with England, he was, to put it kindly, bored. He wasn't sure if that was a genuine feeling or the collective emotion from all the spirits living in his soul's cape, but the effect was the same. So Merlin suggested something to him. She told him that she'd been, somehow, communicating with another version of herself, and had heard of a singularity formed in the ancient times of Babylonia. It was the perfect chance. Shiro had been reluctant at first, wary that he'd find no way to return back to the home he'd made, but he was gently reminded that he had both Merlin and Hanami, one a master magus with a massive breadth of knowledge, and the other a growing magician, one who's began to learn to control the second magic, kaleidoscope, somehow. He's still unsure on how the hell she even managed to do that. Still, his partner had the tendency to break past normal conventions, so he supposed he shouldn't even be surprised. Then, suddenly, he began to hear the distant sound of clashing metal, sounding somewhat like a sharp object grating against a dull one. There's RK. Merlin said. Wisps of bright purple flowers begin to surround him, forming a translucent magical barrier, ready to soften his crash. Nodding, Shiro turns to face the sky, and rearing his arm back, he punches forward, sending a blast of wind up and blasting him down. As he continued to near, the clashes grew louder, and he began to pick up someone shouting in worry. Narrowing his eyes, he punched again, doubling his speed, and with only 100 meters between him and the earth, he brought forward Uriel. Reinforcing his eyes, he sees the tail of bright green hair, and he raises his arms. And like a comet, he crashed against the earth with enough force to catapult tons of earthly materials into the air. Dirt and stone flew into the air, chunks of wood were flung as the trees were torn from their grounds, and a thick burst of dust shrouded the air. The ground turned hot and red, some even melting from the power of his downward strike. With his reinforced eyes, he spots a pair of girls, each clearly an outsider to this ancient time, and quickly went to them, deflecting away the incoming rain of swords and spears from the enemy. Slowly, the dust settled, and there standing before him was who looked to be a female, clothed only in a long white cloak. He would have been beautiful, if not for the scowl that marred his face. You! He growled, furious but clearly wary of this new foe. Shiro stared back, switching Yormer's blade for the Kojiki Kaimitsu. He needed the speed, for even though his downward plummet far exceeded the speed of sound, he still managed to dodge, turning part of his left hand into a chain and pulling himself away. But that short clash was enough to glean his identity. A tool made from clay, formed and given life by the gods. He who worked as the shackle to the Almighty King. He who matched the king with strength and number. He who was his friend, and who perished by the orders of the ruling gods. Enkidu, the chain of heavens. Truthfully, he wasn't expecting such a thorough finding from just a single glance, a clear sign of what his training and Merlin's help had done to his structural analysis. Despite that, he knew something wasn't right. Something about him didn't feel right, almost like a jigsaw puzzle with a piece of it misplaced. Merlin shared his thoughts, but remained quiet to let him focus on the task at hand. Alright, let's take him down, Shiro. Smiling, he brandished his blade, feeling the familiar feeling of his soul merging with another. Full embodiment. He called out, and ribbons of light wrapped around him in a cocoon, changing him. Then, the shell cracked, and Shiro came out changed. Now, he was clothed in a white and black hakama, his hair a pinkish white and his eyes a pale gold. He heard a shocked gasp coming from behind him, but he cared not. An enemy stood before him, and the one he needed to protect was behind him. Nothing else mattered. Immediately, the dirt under Enkidu molded into blades, and they fired off at speeds to rival Gilgamesh's Gate of Babylon. But he was faster. He slipped beneath the rain of blades and swung his sword. Enkidu responded in kind, turning his arm into a sword and meeting his. The earth around them was blown away, but the two remained in place, sword pressed against the other, both eyes staring at one another. Enkidu broke away and sent a powerful kick, but he stepped forward and slammed the butt of his hilt onto it, directing the speeding leg down onto the dirt. He thrust his sword forward, and Enkidu barely managed to morph his other hand into a chain and wrap it around his sword, stopping the blade just inches from his neck. Smiling, he pulled back, pulling his katana from his grasp, but Shiro only took a step back, reared his arm back, and with a reinforced fist he struck at his stomach. A pained gasp left his mouth as he was thrown back, turning his hand into a claw to skid himself to a stop. But the short moment allowed Shiro to close the gap, his pale gold eyes shining as he reared his sword back. Mumyu dash. Enkidu's eyes shot open, surprised by the sudden influx of prana. Sandenzuki. At a singular moment, 3 thrusts were launched, bypassing the laws of space and time. A giant sharp wave of wind shot out from his noble phantasm, uprooting trees and tearing them away. However, Enkidu was nowhere in sight, gone, with only a small sliver of green hair left behind. Did he teleport? Perhaps, but I didn't sense any sort of magical pulse from him. Merlin completed, sounding just as confused. Nevertheless, keep that strand of hair with you. It'll help to track him down. Letting a breath free, he and Okita unmerged, and he bent down to pick up the leftover strand of hair. Tucking it in his pocket, he steeled himself and turned to the 2 girls he'd protected, smiling wryly as he saw the stars shining in the girls' eyes. My name's Shiro. What's your name? Ritsuka Fujimaru, last master of an organization called Chaldeas. Currently traveling to save humanity from certain extinction. Cheerful but determined, both jaded from experience but brimming with naive hope. Mash Kirilite, demi-servant shielder. Fights along and under Ritsuka's commands. Demure and bashful like a flower, but with a fire of determination burning behind her eyes. He'd introduced himself as a demi-servant, much like Mash, summoned under the class of Saber and holding within him the spirit of Okita Tsuji. Brought into the ancient time of Mesopotamia by the wizard Merlin to help combat the encroaching phantasmal beasts. Having heard their introductions, he gives his own, and the 2 stares at him with unconcealed wonder. He can't quite help but smile shyly, considering that the picture of himself he'd given isn't close in any manner to what he can truly do. But he can't just give out all his cards immediately, right? Both Hanami and Merlin lectured him heavily on that matter. Now, they're on their way towards Uruk, intent on meeting both the ruling king and Merlin's male counterpart. On the way, they'd battle against the roaming phantasmal beasts, with Shiro occasionally giving the shielder some advice on how to move her body to maximize the damage she could do with her shield. Surprisingly, Yormer has a rather large stockpile of knowledge in regards to the usage of shields, despite not really using one himself. Shiro asked, and the response to that was just another jovial laugh. That aside, to keep up his appearance as a summoned demi-servant, he'd gone and bound himself to Ritsuka. Similar to creating a master-servant bond, but slightly altered, both to fit Ritsuka's rather strange set of command seals and his own strange existence as a faux demi-servant. It's odd, really. He knows how it feels to have someone else be under his command, to have a grasp over someone else, but being the one under the command seal is a new feeling. Not a bad one, just strange. Although, the bond between him and Ritsuka feels weaker than he'd expect from a master-servant bond, but the cause is uncertain. Still, being able to power up just by working with Ritsuka's demands is quite an exhilarating feeling. Hey, Shiro. He stops, turning to look at Ritsuka. Yes? Are you a magus? Shiro blinks, surprised to hear that. Why do you say that? After all, he hasn't done any major magecraft, has he? Well, you use reinforcement and structural analysis a lot, and there's that cool shredder thing you like to do. She says, and Shiro can't quite help but smile a little. Observant girl. He thinks, and nods in reply. Yes, not a great one though. The best I can do is using structural analysis, reinforcement, and Gihen. He explains, though still withholding the rest of his other capabilities. Gihen? She asks again, and Mash turns to them, clearly interested in the new magecraft they'd never heard before. Which makes sense really, since it doesn't seem to be a common spell considering not even his dad knew about it. It's a spell derived from reinforcement. He begins, picking up a stray rock and applying reinforcement onto it. When you reinforce something, you fill the gaps, the imperfections in the object with prana and strengthen it, but if you apply too much dash, he overflows the rock with prana, and the thing explodes into dust and shards. And it explodes. Gihen works the same way, filling the gaps inside an object with prana, but then expanding rapidly to destroy its inner structure instead of reinforcing it, causing it to crumble from the inside. He finishes, silently patting his back in relief for managing to remember the entire explanation Hanami had given him about the spell. Would I be able to do that too? He hears her whisper. It'd be hard, but you should. He says, and she blinks at him, surprised he'd heard her. I'm a third rate at best, but I managed it. You have more magic circuits than I do, and none of them are atrophied either. Atrophied? Ah. He shouldn't have mentioned that. It's nothing. Ooh, you can't do that. Now I'm even more curious. She says, smiling in excitement. He smiles back, but makes no further comment, unwilling to share the idiocies of his past training before Hanami came into the picture. He really should have been dead after cannibalizing his nerves, and it's only because of Avalon that he still lives. Don't be like that, senpai. Mash gently says, giggling as Ritsuka pouts at her, clearly unamused. Shiro watches it all with a small smile. Is there something on my face, Shiro-kun? Merlin, a male Merlin, asks him, tilting his head curiously at him. Shiro blinks, somewhat surprised by the sudden call, but he quickly recovers and looks away. It's nothing, don't worry. He says, sighing internally as he hears his Merlin, or as Merle as she's currently calling herself, giggle. I'm just not used to it. He tries to reason, but his words fall on deaf ears, and Shiro can only sigh. Merlin hums, leaning in far too close for comfort. Worried about meeting the king perhaps? Not really. He says casually, and Ritsuka stops eating from her bowl and looks up to him in slight surprise. Mash blinks and looks to him as well, and even Merlin looks rather surprised at his casual admittance. After all, they are about to meet Gilgamesh, the very first hero of the throne, and perhaps one of the strongest servants ever recorded. My, confident are you? It's Gilgamesh, right? A male version of him at least, he adds silently. A king who ruled over Uruk, one who faced against the heavens and went down into the underworld, and one who emerged to understand and rule over mankind. He remembers the confidence of Gilgamesh, of her smile as she spoke with Hanami, and he can't help but smile as well. He'll understand. You sound as if you're familiar with him. Merlin says, clearly intrigued. He shrugs. Somewhat. Merlin stares at him for several more seconds, deep in thought, before he smiles and shrugs. Well, time can be the judge of that. He says before turning to Ritsuka. So, have you finished your dinner, Master of Chaldea? I have. He says as she places down her empty bowl, her eyes set in determination. The expression she has is, oddly similar to his. He wonders why that is. Well, then let's go. Merlin says and stands, taking his staff in hand and walking out the small cottage they've been staying in. Ritsuka and Mash follow in his path, leaving him the only one left in the small household. Shiro closes his eyes. So, what have you found, Merlin? Remember, call me Merle, Shiro. She gently reminds him. That aside, it seems our journey this time will pose a much tougher enemy to defeat. You mean Enkidu? Not quite. She says. While the chain of heavens will be a great threat himself, it is the one who revived him that is truly insidious. Revived? Indeed. The one who brought him back is Tiamat, the dragon god of the seas, one of the primal gods of Mesopotamian legends, and one of the great seven beasts of humanity. Merle explains grimly, and Shiro shivers at hearing the name, flashes of an otherworldly enemy appearing in the front of his mind. Can we beat her? He asks, already knowing the answer. Not currently, and not alone. She says. Unlike Erebus, I fear bringing her to Avalon won't be enough. Erebus was immortal because of its ties to the collective unconsciousness of humanity, but Tiamat is different. Why am I even here if we can't take her down? Are you really asking that? She asks dryly. Is it not a hero's task to overcome a seemingly impossible obstacle? He doesn't respond to that. But, well, he can't quite back away now that he's heard of Ritsuka's convictions now, can he? So, with a small smile, he exits the cottage, leaving the thing truly empty. Fujimaru Ritsuka can't help but shake slightly, playing with her fingers to alleviate some of the building worry in her heart. Silently, she takes a glance at Mash, and the Shielder seems just as worried, her eyes snapping from the people and Gilgamesh, the king that sits atop Uruk's throne. She turns again, and she sees Merlin and Shiro. Both are seemingly calm about this, Merlin reading one of the tablets the woman, Siduri if she heard correctly, gave him. Shiro on the other hand seems taken in by the soldiers milling about the room, his eyes flashing a bright greenish blue as he looks around. Wonder what he's doing. Before she can ask however, the man in the king's audience leaves the room, and it's now their turn to meet with the king. Taking a deep breath, Ritsuka steels herself and steps forward, her eyes kept high. I have returned, your majesty. Merlin begins with a bow, smiling as he looks to Gilgamesh. These two are the ones I have informed you with. Last master of humanity, and demi-servant Shielder. Both tied to Chaldea, arriving from the future to save the past. Gilgamesh states, and Ritsuka blinks, surprised he'd known so much about the two. The stars told me so. He answers, somehow having heard the question in her mind. As a king, it is imperative that I hold knowledge over the flow of time. He smiles slightly as he sees the master's jaw drop slightly. Then, he turns to Shiro. However, you are very much an unknown variable, one not even the stars can comprehend. Ritsuka turns to Shiro, who simply shrugs. I'm not sure why myself. My summoning into this time was a rather sudden thing. He says, frowning slightly. Oh. And who is your summoner? Gilgamesh asks, and with delay, Shiro points his finger at the flower magus. Merlin blinks at the sudden attention brought to him. And you didn't inform me of this? He asks with narrowed eyes, and Merlin smiles wryly. In my defense, the opportunity was rather sudden for me as well. There was no telling if his summoning would be a success had I waited even a single minute later. Gilgamesh hums, clearly not believing his reasoning. Instead, he turns back to Ritsuka, sizing her up. The air around them grows heavy as magical energy begins filling the atmosphere, golden portals glowing by his sides. Leave the room. Yes, sir. Siduri, who'd been standing by his side, bows and turns to leave, the rest of the people in the room following her. Soon, only the king and the four newcomers remain, and he stands. He brings forth a stone book, glowing with golden sigils, and staves of many kinds begin to extend out from the portals behind him. Now, prove your worth, master of Chaldea. And with no further words, the staves fire, bombarding them with a shower of magical bullets. Mash! Ritsuka calls, and the girl quickly responds, summoning her shield and bringing it forward, blocking the incoming rain of attacks. Rush him! Yes. With incredible strength, Mash hefts the shield over her shoulder and leaps forward, the noble phantasm ready to be swung. Shiro watches it all from the sidelines, a small smile present on his face. Not going to join, Shiro-kun? Merlin asks, slyly smiling, but eyes shining with genuine curiosity. No. This is their test. He has no right to join in, and he will not. He knows that the two girls are overpowered by Gilgamesh. He's sure the Chaldeans know that too, yet their eyes remain set in determination, Ritsuka's voice steady as she says her orders, Mash's shield ever vigilant as she leapt onwards. But is it not a hero's task to intervene? Merlin asks, mirroring the question Merle had asked him many nights ago. Shiro simply stared at him and asked back. What is a hero? A hero? Hanami asked, wondering why he'd suddenly asked her that. She soon quiets down, idly cradling the cup of tea in her hands as she ponders. In truth, he'd been restless for the past few days. Though traveling about England with Saber had been a calming experience, it brought out a thought he'd long buried in the back of his mind. Did this world truly need a hero of justice? He knew that the dream Kiritsugu had passed to him is nothing but a fleeting one. There is no possible way for everyone to be saved. If one is saved, another will be lost. If one wins, another shall face defeat. But as he once more walked through the streets, he saw people milling about, men and women heading for their jobs, children playing and laughing. There is no imminent danger for them, no threat, and even with the growing worry over the recent events left behind after the destruction of the Grail War, the world moved on. Saber was content at seeing just how much everything had grown, but Shiro only grew restless. Was there really any need for a hero? Well, I personally think the entire concept of heroism is flawed in the first place. Hanami said, and Shiro stills. A hero is to others a villain, and vice versa. There is but a fine line separating the two, and there might be no reason for them to be separate at all. Strangely, he finds himself compelled to listen, the rest of the world growing into silent static as only she remained. Consider a thief. He works day and night, laughing as he steals treasures and sells them to make big profits. But then, he throws his costume away and gives all he earned to the hospital, hoping to make a dent in the debt he'd made to save his ailing daughter. A villain he may be to the ones enforcing the law, but to his daughter, and to all who knows of his cause, what else can he be but a hero? She was right. Of course she was. Even someone as gallant and as righteous as Saber isn't freed from such a thing. She's a heralded hero for the people she fought for, but for the men she fought against? She was a monster, one that soaked the earth in their blood. But, well, looking at it using just that perspective won't bear much fruit, right? She suddenly added, looking at him with a smile. What do you mean? A hero means different things to every person. Just as justice has no true concrete meaning, so does a hero. She took a sip of her tea. A hero is whoever you want them to be. It could be your parents, your friends, your instructor, maybe even someone like Taiga, who'd helped you through your everyday life. To me, a hero is an ordinary person, one who simply goes about their days, but one who'll step up in certain circumstances and become extraordinary. She said, finally emptying the cup she'd been holding. Of course, that's only what I think. She added with a laugh, her gaze held towards the stars above, her eyes seemingly looking towards a world beyond this one. But what about you, Shiro? What do you think a hero is? In the end, he couldn't come up with an answer, but Hanami simply smiled and patted his shoulder, coaxing him to return and sleep for the night. And so he did, resting his body as his mind continued to ponder. Indeed, what is a hero? Merlin hums, rubbing his chin. What do you think, Shiro-kun? I don't know. He admits, frowning slightly. Even after many hours spent pondering the question, and listening to many lectures from both Merle and Yormer about it, he still hasn't come to an answer. Well, whatever answer you may come to, I believe it's time to finally rest, no? Ritsuka and Mash over there seem to be struggling to even stay awake. Merlin says, and blinking, Shiro turns to see the battle over. Gilgamesh sits back on his throne, frowning slightly but with no visible evidence of the battle, while Mash is visibly exhausted, having to be supported by a similarly exhausted Ritsuka. Did I really blank out for that long? Immediately, every single individual living in his soul responds with a powerful, yes. Wow. In the deep of night, Ritsuka wakes, the recent battle still ringing in her ears. I have no use for you. Gilgamesh had said, and it hurt her slightly. Siduri had comforted her of course, saying that he simply meant he currently had no need for any extreme actions from the two of them, but it still made her feel hollow. Ritsuka knows she's nothing without the command seals inscribed on her hand. She's not even a real magus, but one that had somehow gotten pulled into this journey across the ages. Sometimes she'd wonder why she was the one to have to journey, why she was saved while the other magi were taken away by that explosion. But such thoughts can be saved after they finish this journey, after they finally face off against the one behind the incineration of humanity. Standing up from the bed, she looks around. Merlin is asleep at the table, the glass he'd been drinking from left half full, Mash is asleep not far from her, in another bed tucked in the corner, and Foe is snuggling with her, the little critter taking in the girl's warmth. Only Shiro is strangely absent. Blinking, she sharpens her senses, trying to hear if he might be anywhere near. She does. She hears the distant sounds of flowing winds, accompanied by the gentle tapping of footsteps against the earth. Gently, she rises from her bed and makes her way to the door, doing her best to not wake the others. Thankfully, she'd gotten some lessons in sneaking from the various assassins she's met through this grand order, so she escapes the small cottage with hardly any trouble. Sighing in relief, she ventures out, following in the direction of where the sounds are coming from. Soon, she reaches a small opening, hidden north from where she'd been sleeping. And there, she sees Shiro. His eyes are closed, and his body relaxed as he moves, changing from one kata to another. The style seems rather familiar, as if she's seen it somewhere before, but the answer escapes her. He moves with grace born from experience, pacing from one stance to another like an elaborate dance. Every move, every strike he makes sends forth a blast of wind, and the dust below him rises with every movement, almost swirling around him. She finds herself silenced. Because under the glow of the moon, with the night sky decorated with thousands of blinking stars, he looks beautiful, almost divine. Ritsuka can feel her muscles ache, wanting to join in, needing to follow the motions of the demi-servant before her. As a budding martial artist herself, she couldn't help but follow through his every motion, her structural analysis, activating in every moment to sear his movements into her memory. Swift yet deadly. Silent yet impactful. Durable but adaptive. Beautiful, isn't it? Ritsuka nearly yelps as she hears Merlin comment from her side. Merlin? She says softly, doing her best not to disturb Shiro. Did I wake you? The magus smiles at her. Don't worry, Ritsuka-chan. I very rarely sleep after all. She blinks. But, you were. A convincing act, was it not? He says, smiling with amusement. Of course, it's not that I do not sleep, but that I simply don't have a need for it. My body runs purely on prana after all. Alright. She's completely forgotten about that actually. Servants don't need to eat, sleep, or sate natural human needs. Wait, then why did so many of the servants she met sleep so much? But that aside, what do you think of him, Ritsuka-chan? He's one of a kind, isn't he? Yeah. She recalls the blood he left in his wake as he cleaved through hundreds of demonic beasts, looking like he barely broke a sweat, while she and Mash struggled even facing against a group of 7 or more of those same demonic beasts. And he did all that with his bare hands as well. Furthermore, there's that Gihen of his. In concept, it was a simple thing, but to actually manage to do something like that was near impossible. Even Romani and Da Vinci were surprised to hear about it, with the servant commenting that it had essentially turned his blade into an unstoppable force. Actually, why don't you ask him to teach you? Merlin suddenly says. I don't think he'd mind teaching you. He adds, smiling at her. After all, you wish to become stronger yourself, right? She looks at him, surprised. How did he know dash? Merlin doesn't say anything, but he simply gestures towards Shiro, and she can only stare at the boy. As kind as he is, she doubts he'd be willing to share his techniques when not even a day has passed since they met. She turned to Merlin, her reasons ready to be said, but by the time she turned, the magus was already gone, leaving nothing but the fragrance of flowers. Ritsuka. She hears Shiro say, and she quickly turns to him, smiling as her cheeks lit up with embarrassment. Hello there. She says lamely, and Shiro merely tilts his head in confusion. Ah. That's adorable, some part of her mind says, and though she agrees, she quickly banishes the thought, her cheeks growing redder with every passing second. Why are you still awake? She asks with a soft cough. He blinks. I'm training. You? Ah, well. What can she even say? That she woke up in the middle of the night, saw that he wasn't in the cottage, and decided to find him? Thankfully, Shiro answers it for her. Couldn't sleep? He asks, and while not technically true, she nods. Seeing that, he smiles kindly, patting his shirt to blow away some of the dust he'd caught from before. Hey, Shiro. She begins, and the boy turns to her. Did you learn martial arts on your own? He blinks. You were watching. Silently, she nods, and Shiro smiles shyly, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, I learned most of it from someone else. It was, in the middle of a battle, and I needed to get an edge over my opponent, so I forced myself to learn using structural analysis. He explains. Ah. So Shiro learned it in the midst of a battle? What battle though, and against who? Why ask though? Well, Ritsuka takes a moment to calm herself, and steeling herself, she looks up to him. Can you tutor me? Tutor you? He asks, incredulous. Ah, well, if you don't want to, it's dash. No, it's fine. I was just surprised. He quickly assures, smiling at her. I've always been the one to learn under someone else, so having someone come to me to learn under me is, well, it's a weird feeling. So, you accept? She tries, and in response, Shiro gives her a smile. He nods, and she immediately brightens up, a smile easily appearing on her face. So, when do we start? Anytime you're ready. He says, his smile now challenging, and she rises to the challenge without any further words. Shiro, she finds, is a wonderful teacher. A tough, somewhat harsh teacher, but a wonderful one nonetheless. It almost reminds her of Lady Scathach, just much kinder in words. But just like Lady Scathact, he also lacks restraint. By the time morning arrives, she's a giant bundle of bruises and bandages, and Shiro can only apologize with a grimace. He truly wasn't using most of his power, and though that still annoyed Ritsuka, she understands. Even with her using reinforcement and him not, he still managed to break through her defenses, shattering her reinforcement like fragile glass. Well, such is the difference between a human and a servant, or demi-servant in this case. Thankfully, Merlin is there to soothe some of her bruises, and the tasks Iduri had given her and Mash are hardly physical ones. She and Mash soon go off to help with the locals, Merlin goes to meet Gilgamesh, and Shiro heads for the winery, excited to both help and learn about the art of winemaking. It was nice, and the smiles she received from the people made it all the better. Soon, noon rolls around, and she and Mash head to the market to meet up with Shiro. And there, she sees perhaps the strangest sight she's come to see yet. Shiro looks around with a strained smile, frozen in place as the people around him bow to him in reverence, some even chanting and praying to him like he's some sort of local deity. Then, his eyes lock onto hers, and she sees the panic and the need for help shining in his orange eyes. What happened here? Mash goes off and asks one of the locals, a young woman, and she smiles back at the girl. As it was noon, many had come here to have some food for lunch. But Shiro had volunteered to help us. The woman stares at him, her eyes filled with no small amount of adoration. The food he cooked was legendary, so much so that nearly everyone was brought to tears. Even the blandest of foods were turned into a culinary delight by him. Wow! Mash turns her fellow demi-servant with a new sense of wonder, and Ritsuka does the same. Quickly, she asks one of the locals to share the food, and with barely any restraint, he gives some pieces of the normally bland meat. The moment she tastes it, flavor explodes in her mouth, and she immediately understands what the woman meant. How? There are hardly any spices to use, and definitely no cooking utensils to help, so how did the bland meat become this extravagant? She stares at the pieces of meat in disbelief, wondering if he'd somehow used his magecraft to enhance the taste, but that's clearly impossible, right? Right? In the end, Shiro spent most of his time cooking for the masses, using the limited set of ingredients and tools to cook simple hamburger patties for the people to enjoy. He isn't really sure why people suddenly started to treat him like he's some sort of god, nor does he understand why Gilgamesh keeps asking him to be his personal cook after trying one of his foods. Maybe it was a Mesopotamian thing. Whatever the case may be, he declines the offer, but remains open to helping the people cook. He will no doubt be brought into the front lines after all. At night, a large group of soldiers return to Uruk, with 3 individuals leading them, each looking far too out of place in this ancient time, and are clearly servants brought from the throne. He soon learns their names. Ushiwakamaru, though simply called Ushi to keep her name short. A rider summoned by Gilgamesh, and a military commander famed for her skills and ruthlessness in the warring era. Benkei, Lancer Servant. A warrior monk with immovable endurance and a back carrying 100 weapons. A comrade who once fought by Ushi's side until the very end, though there's clearly something wrong with that, the history he received from his weapons seems rather sketchy. Leonidas, also a lancer. A warrior king that is famed to have led his 300 men to fight against an army of 100,000 soldiers, and one whose spirit remains indomitable even in the direst of odds. Of course, once again, he's saddled to be the chef for the servants, who eat and drink with far too little restraint for people summoned to fight against the end of the world. But, maybe that's what makes them so great in the first place. He remains silent for most of the night, mostly discussing things with Merle and Yormer while the world goes on around him. Soon, night falls, Uruk falls asleep, and he goes out to train like he's done for the past couple months. Of course, there's his promise to train Ritsuka, but the girl is still rather bruised from the training the night before, and she's rather tired out from the day, so he leaves her to rest for the night. However, just as he's about to begin his training, a familiar smell makes itself present, one of old, dusty gems and the embers of a dazzling fire. There was only one person such a smell could belong to. It could be a trap, master. Sasaki speaks up for the first time in days, and Shiro frowns. It could be. But it can also be something else. He isn't backing down, and Sasaki swiftly realizes that. Expects it even. Do not worry. I don't intend to dissuade you, master, but please exercise caution. The assassin goes quiet after that. Nodding, he heads in the direction his nose is leading him to. He turns and moves, going from one path to another, before he finally reaches a small clearing with a small water well situated in the center. There, sitting by the edge of the well, is a very familiar girl. Rin? Rin, of whoever this is, turns to him. And squeaks. He almost falls, the sudden sound of surprise and unexpected surprise, especially coming from someone who looks and sounds like Rin. And while he doesn't fall, Rin certainly does, tilting too far and beginning to fall into the well. Thankfully, he is quite fast. One moment he's standing still, then the next he's suddenly beside her, cradling her back and holding from falling into that watery abyss. Rin squeaks again, her red eyes staring in surprise at him, and even without structural analysis, he realizes. She's not Rin. Her normally bright teal eyes are replaced with an almost fiery red, and the presence within her is divine. Well, that, and her clothes are far too flimsy and far too revealing for someone like Rin to actually wear. Even then, seeing her, something in him aches slightly, knowing that his Rin died in his time, drowning inside the tainted mud of the Grail. Are you alright? He asks, and though her face is completely tinged with red, she nods. Of course, he still does a quick check over her, and seeing no injuries, he smiles. I see. That's good. Somehow, his smile causes her to squeak again, burying her face in her hands, and he can only watch in confused amusement. The embarrassment she's going through causes the glamour on her to momentarily fade, her black hair shifting to a bright yellow and her scandalous clothes suddenly replaced by a comfortable black cloak. The image quickly disappears, but he knows what he saw is real, and can only wonder who this Rin lookalike truly is. Anyway, what are you doing here so late at night, miss? He asks, trying to shift the atmosphere. And it works, the girl's suddenly gaining confidence and asking back. And I could ask the same. Why are you out so late, sir? I train at night. He says with a shrug. There are less people to interrupt. Oh. She blinks, surprised at the simple answer, before she realizes that his eyes are now on hers and his question for her still remains unanswered. Well, I myself was just looking around. Yes, just that. Looking around, by sitting at a water well. He asks, his lips curled to an amused smile, and all she can do is curl on herself in shame over the lame excuse she'd given. Which, of course, leads her to realize that he's still holding her in his arms, further building over her embarrassment. Shiro can't quite help but laugh slightly, some part of this situation is nostalgic to him, and he lets the flustered girl down for the first time in minutes. The girl seems thankful for it, and lets out a relieved sigh. Thank you, for saving me, and, well, that. She says in between stutters, and he simply nods with a smile. Well, can I have a name? Ishtar. My name's Ishtar. She answers far too quickly. Lie. He easily realizes. In truth, lies have a hard time getting by him now, as if everything he hears and reads is put through a scanner before it enters his brain. Maybe it's Avalon affecting him. Or maybe someone else, like Merle or Yormer. Nevertheless, it's a useful boon to have. Still, despite it being a lie, he doesn't question further, instead, backing away slightly. Ishtar stares at him, confused. What are you doing? She asks, and he gently taps the dusty soil with his foot. I went out to train, and this is a perfect place for it. Oh, right. She says, remembering the reason he'd said to her earlier. Shiro doesn't say anything else after that, instead focusing on himself. The world fades, shifting to a grasslands, colored by an afternoon sky tinged orange by the setting sun, and before him, a fog begins to appear, slowly taking the shape of a familiar assassin, his fists ready to strike. So, against this imaginary enemy, Shiro rushes forward, trading blows against an opponent drawn from the depths of his mind and soul. And Ishtar watches in fascination and wonder as he combats against an enemy unseen to the world. She can only wonder who this boy before her is. It's also until later that she realizes she hadn't even asked for a name, and she cursed her own inattentiveness. The town of, you are? Ritsuka asks, confused yet intrigued. Gilgamesh nods. Indeed. It's a small town within a dense jungle. It's been some time since I last went there. I wish for you to survey it. Ritsuka looks at him for a moment, before she nods, a resolute smile taking place. I will. She says, and Gilgamesh smiles back. Shiro watches it all silently. It's a test. He realizes. Gilgamesh doesn't need them to head to, you are. He could just use his passive noble phantasm to see through the stars and watch the world. That is what he is famed for, as he is the king that watches from outside, away from humans and gods. Not only that, But Merlin had told him that Gilgamesh had used the Grail to summon 7 servants, all working under his will to protect the last bastion of humanity against the rising tides. Now, only 3 of those servants remained, with 2 other 5 having disappeared when they ventured out towards that jungle. He'd have mentioned this to Ritsuka as they left, of course, it's something he'd usually do, but he stays silent. As Gilgamesh spoke, he noticed the king sending glances towards him, acknowledging that Shiro knows of a truth, or a figment of it, but asking for his silence. That, and Merlin had not so discreetly sent him a telepathic message telling him to conceal his thoughts. Also, Merlin oddly decided to not join them, despite having stated that he'd joined them on their journey just the night before. The Magus is clearly up to something, but what that something is, Shiro doesn't know. Nevertheless, he remains quiet. On their way out of Uruk, the 3 servants they'd met a day ago come to see them off, with Ushi being particularly worried over the Chaldean master. Ritsuka quickly reassures her though, stating that everything will be fine with him protecting her. Ushi looks at him for a moment, before sighing and letting the issue go. And so, as the morning continues, they bid farewell to the city of Uruk, venturing towards the jungle surrounding Ur. The trip there is surprisingly relaxing, with hardly any encounters against the demonic beasts, and when they do, the beasts are quickly dispatched with the edge of his blade. So, to spend the time, he begins to give several tips to Ritsuka over the usage of reinforcement, on what to do and what not to do, and over what shortcuts she can take to maximize efficiency. The girl, as he expects, is eager to learn more, though she's rather surprised to hear some of the things reinforcement can even do. Which makes sense. There are hardly any magi that even dare to spend most of their life learning over what they see as a simple, boorish spell. He also notices Mash and the 2 directors of Chaldea, Roman and Da Vinci, if he recalls correctly, not so secretly listening in. Reinforcing an aspect. He nods and begins to explain. Take a sword for example. True, you could apply reinforcement onto the blade and make it sharper, tougher, more durable. But if all you're looking for is to sharpen it, then the rest of the effects are rather worthless. I think it's called min-maxing, if I remember it right. So instead of just reinforcing your sword, you reinforce its sharpness, turning the other enhancements reinforcement grants towards sharpening the sword. Though brittle, the sword would then be able to cut through things no sword should be able to. He finishes, before smiling and adding, well, unless that sword is a noble phantasm of course. You won't need to worry as much about a noble phantasm breaking. As an example, stopping for a moment, he bends down and picks up a random pebble, reinforcing it. You can do things like this. Seeing a distant rock formation, he throws the pebble. Ritsuka and Mash watch in amazement as the thing flies with the speed of a bullet, before crashing against the rock formation and smashing it entirely. That's what happens when you reinforce the impact force. Wow. She says, before looking down at her own hands, frowning. Can I even do that? Not now, and maybe never as efficiently, but I think so. He says confidently. She is, after all, a much better magus for someone with a short belt of experience like hers. Well, that, and she isn't a complete idiot and atrophied her own magic circuits when she first began learning. Ritsuka remains unsure, but she brightens up considerably at his assurance. They continue on, with him continuing his lessons on magecraft for his current master, doing his best to impart his advanced methods. The girl doesn't make much progress throughout the journey, but it makes sense. He had over a decade worth of experience, and had Hanami and her wisdom to teach him. Still, with time and effort, he's sure she'll eventually take it in. And so, after hours of traveling, they reach the jungle they'd been tasked to go to. Narrowing his eyes, he brings out the Kojiki Kaimitsu, readying himself for any unsuspecting enemies. Mash does the same and brings out her shield, and Ritsuka stands behind the 2 of them, her commands ready to be spoken at any moment. Slowly, they advance, pushing through dense foliage. The forest is calm, with only the slight rustling from small critters sounding in his ears. Then, suddenly, he catches whiff of a strange smell, one that oddly reminds him of a tiger. Shiro freezes. Gao! A figure suddenly appears, wearing a strange tiger hoodie and wielding the strangest polearm he'd ever seen, composed of a metallic rod and a comical tiger's paw as its head. She looks hardly imposing. But more than that. Fujine. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.